So we're ready?
Anytime.
Okay. So I'm going to start off with some of the questions on Clara wrote down for me.
It's fine.
First one is, how do you see the profession of planning in the present day? And what role does geodesign play in the profession?
I've seen in my career, which began in the 1950s, ebbs and flows in planning, from physical planning to economic planning to regional planning to urban planning and urban design to administrative planning and back toward regional and physical planning. And what's interesting is that in some of these periods, the schools were ahead of the profession, and in some of these periods, the schools were behind the profession. And right now, if I look at Europe, North America, what I have seen in South America, and what I've seen in China, India, mainly those countries, the schools are a little bit ahead of the profession. And the reason for that is we're in a period in which administrative rulemaking and regulatory approaches are dominant. And what's happening in the schools is a mix, that some schools in some countries are more producing administrators, and some schools are recognizing two things. One is that the systems in which these administrators are being trained to work are changing very rapidly. The second thing that they're recognizing is that the amount of urban change that the world faces in the next 30 years, let's say, is enormous. The World Bank estimates that we're building the equivalent of a city of 1 million people every week. That's not building a whole city, it's adding to the existing cities, but the scale of physical change and systems change is very profound. And some schools are recognizing that we need to educate people to manage these systems, which are changing fast and which are changing through entrepreneurial means rather than bureaucratic means. And so ideas like separation of functions in the city by zoning are less now in forward-looking cities. Complexity is greater. Diversity is greater. And so the idea that you can manage a city through rules is getting less. And so the question then is, well, how do you manage it? And it's much more related to multidisciplinary design, adaptation, temporary aspects of cities becoming more important. And geodesign is at the middle of that, in the sense that it's not treating a city and an urbanistic environment like a building, and it's not treating it like a science. It's a mixture of those. And one consequence, there's a very powerful consequence of that, and that is that normally in both practice and in education, we're more focused on producing specialists. But 50 years ago, 60 years ago, planners were much more generalists. They had to know a lot about a little, as opposed to a little about a lot. And so what we're now beginning to see, largely through geodesign, but not only through that, was a greater attention to multidisciplinary ways of thinking and practicing. And we're producing more generalists because I think we need them. We need 10,000 people who are more generalists. We need them in the next 10 years. And the universities are the only place where they can come from. But their practice will be different from the practice of specialists who know their specialty but don't work very well with the next specialty. And those are changes. Those are, I think, very profound changes and very healthy ones. And the work that I'm trying to do is in the middle of that, because I consider myself a generalist. I have my specialties, but I can talk to lots of people, and my students are trained not to make one design by one student, but to make one design for 15 students, and see how do you manage that process. So I find it a big challenge, and in the last 10 years I've spent my life teaching teachers, because they're not trained because of their education to produce generalists, because they skipped a generation of your faculties around the world are specialists, much more. And I think that's important, by the way, but not enough. It's not enough to solve the very difficult problems that the world faces.
And on the same topic, we have, as you know, we have no landscape planning courses in Brazil.
I think it's terrible. It's stupid and it's terrible. Because your country is going to be destroyed by the landscape being destroyed. I have a friend, a very good friend. He says, if the landscape is wrong, it's all wrong. All right? Mm-hmm. If your landscape is destroyed, your water system is destroyed. If your water system is destroyed, forget about the city. Mm-hmm. Period. Finished.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there's this division between entrepreneurial activities and bureaucratic activities in the geodesign. How do you see that? Is there like a middle ground?
I think there's a negotiation ground. That's why I focused in my talk while I was here. I focused on the idea of negotiation as a design method, and that's not the tradition of design. The design is my design, not your design, as opposed to our design. But when you're thinking of a region, or you're thinking of a large part of a city, nobody knows enough. No one profession knows enough. So it has to be collaborative. It has to be multidisciplinary. It has to be negotiated. And furthermore, the people you're designing for, who are you designing for when you're designing for 30 years? Those people may be not alive yet. And the people who are there now may all be dead. So how do you negotiate between clients who you think know what they want, but who are going to be in a changing environment during their lifetime, and certainly in the next generation's lifetime? Mm-hmm. And none of us knows the exact answer for that. So we have to figure ways of designing that are robust, resilient, flexible, adaptable, not grand conceptual. And that's not what's being done in practice, and it's not what's being done in the schools. Yeah. It's being done in some, absolutely being some, but not the majority. I've been in my career, I've been in 165 universities, almost all of them planning, design, urban design, architecture, landscape schools. They're all relatively similar. Mm-hmm. They're all teaching a site, a client, and a project. And I'm interested in, I don't know who the client is, the site is huge, and the projects, there are 150 projects in one project. So it's much more diffuse, much more complex, much more fuzzy. And I'm interested in how that process begins, and how do you even think about it? And in that way, I'm influenced by the teachers that I had 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. Kevin Lynch, mainly among them.
And do you see any precautions that are important for governments, universities, and private companies, for them to work together and not get overwhelmed by one another?
That's an easy thing to see and a difficult thing to do. Because right now, in most cities, not all countries and not all cities, they're seen as antithetical to each other. And sometimes when they're seen as collaborating, it's because of corruption. So it's difficult on either extreme. And so I don't have many examples to point to. I really don't. I'd say in Western Europe might be the cleanest of that circumstance. Some parts of America. But it's very rare, actually, because there's a lot of money to be made. And so I don't have an answer for that. I really don't. I think that's a function of political science and democracy to some extent, right?
I think geodesign probably plays a very important part in that. Geodesign tools like Geodesign Hub, maybe.
Well, the tools make it easier to be more democratic and more equitable, but they don't guarantee behavior. That people have to understand that. The ideology may be more equitable and more democratic. The tools may support that by making negotiation easier, but that doesn't mean that human behavior is equitable and fair and democratic. I have people that I know who are trying to do geodesign in tyrannical governments. I know them. And it's very, very hard, okay? And I know people who are working in corrupt governments. And it's very, very hard and very frustrating. But those things change also, and I hope for the better.
I just have one more quick question, and then we'll reset. From your Brazilian experience, what are some of the obstacles you can see for that to overcome the obstacles we have towards territorial planning?
Well, I think the obstacles are probably in three different realms. One is overpopulation and under income. I mean, the destruction of Amazonia is the obvious one that the world is very much aware of. But it's also government. It's also government not enforcing laws that it has. And I think the schools are to blame as well, because the schools are still in a pipeline of specialties. Nobody's doing this. You have an architecture school here. I imagine that they're very, very good at having their students design buildings and very, very bad at having them design all of Minas Gerais. And yet they think professionally that the architect is responsible for designing Minas Gerais. And I think that that's outrageous. It's stupid, fundamentally stupid. Now, the question that follows from that is, why should it be in the architecture school? Why shouldn't it be in the agronomy and the architecture and the civil engineering and the hydrology and the ecology and the sociology school and taught as a collective across the university? Not this way, but this way, which is what I think should happen. And I've advised many universities along those lines. And then the question, of course, is that the architecture counts, Collegio de Arquitectos, whatever it's called, will say, never, we're the persons. And the engineers will say, never, we're the persons. And the hydrologists will say, never, we're the persons. And they're all wrong. They're just all wrong. If they can't do this, it won't work.
Do you think it's rather a question of making the current courses more multidisciplinary, or landscape planning? Working on projects inside the university that require multidisciplinary work, and that the students and the faculties teach each other what they know
so that the students have a broad experience in a project that needs to have a solution. All right? So you may remember that a year and a half ago we gave a workshop here on the very important problem of whether the mining in Minas Gerais by 2050 should stop. And we had people from many, many disciplines, including from the mining industry, from the city, from the region, from hydrology, from ecology. We had a very broad group of people. And they had to act in their own interest, but negotiate with each other. I would never hesitate to give the same problem to 30 students from across the university. Solve this problem.
Okay.
They would learn a lot. And have 10 faculty members each presenting their own perspectives as professors of ecology, hydrology, mining, economy, and history, for example, as opposed to architecture only. That's a big difference. And those students would have a very different experience. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a specialty also, but not just a specialty. They have to have this, and they have to have this, and they're not having this.
So what does that mean for the organization of the university?
Well, I taught for almost 50 years at Harvard, which has a huge advantage. It's the richest university in the world. And about 10 or 12 years ago, the president of Harvard, who controls a large budget, said what he's going to do is he's going to identify the world's most important problems and only give Central University money that he controls to teams from across the schools. And so we created a very powerful center for the environment, a center for the brain, a center in public disease, a center, by the way, in early education. There are 5 or 6 of them. And what he did was, that's faculty, 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 faculty. Let's call this architecture, let's call this science, let's call this engineering, let's call this law, let's call this business, etc. And he said, I'm going to identify a series of problems. And I'm going to put the money that I have into these problems. And one of them is called environment. And I know that this university has that structure, okay? But the difference is that these schools, they have faculty and they have students and they do research in depth. And these people have faculty, students, and research in breadth. All right? And sometimes they come together. Sometimes they come together, but sometimes not. And so these institutions, this way, are very powerful. Right? They can make appointments, they can give degrees. And the university is focused on disciplines and problems. And the difference is that the disciplines might stay for 200 years. And the problem might stay for 25 years and then disappear, and a new problem comes. And so these people, they have double responsibilities. And that's very, very important, because this is important, but this is also important. So What does it mean? If you have the national problem of Brazil, what are the national problems of Brazil? I can see two of them. Every city that's now 5 million will become 10 million, and every other tree in Amazonia will be lost. Those are big problems. Don't tell me for 1 minute that any one of these can solve that problem. Ipso facto. So now the question is, who's going to solve the problem? Where are these people? And they're not being prepared.
So you think it's more a question of creating research that's cross-disciplinary,
yes,
more than maybe just proposing a new coastal landscape?
That's exactly what I'm saying. I think it's a much more serious problem. Mm-hmm. It's a national crisis, actually. Mm-hmm. And it's not just in Brazil, it's in many countries. Mm-hmm. And that you can understand how conservative faculties are. Faculties fight for money, they fight for power, they fight for prestige inside the university. But that's, in the long term, that's the death line of the university.
I have a new question, a slightly different topic right now, less institutional. Mm-hmm. I'd like you to talk a little bit about your most successful workshops, or most successful case studies in geodesign.
The most successful, I'll give you two different definitions of success. One is where we made the most important sort of intellectual advances in supporting activity with the tools that we're designing. And then I'll give you a different example where we had the greatest effect in the real world. The most interesting ones were the coastal zone of Georgia, which Rosanna presented in the conference, in which we had 10 counties in the state of Georgia and a regional agency that had to coordinate them. And we had 10 different teams making their own designs and then negotiating a regional design. That was very, very important, because almost always you make a set of models that operate across a region. And we said, no, these counties are different. They each have different priorities. They each have their own ways of working. And you have to respect that. But they also need relationships with each other that they have to negotiate. And then in the end, they have to be coordinated. So we were matching the political reality of making a large plan. That was a very important thing. We were not overly simplifying. Another comparable example was the project in Mulranny in Ireland, where we had a village that wanted to make their own plan. No professionals, no computers, no nothing, no GIS, they wanted just to make their own plan. They spent 4 years, they got nothing. They asked us through a friend to come in, and they used our software, and they made a plan in 2 days. And it's a real plan, and they're happy with it. And in a way, what we demonstrated there was that you don't have to be a planner to make a plan. Everybody can make a plan, but you have to be able to articulate what's important to you. And these people could articulate it. And the same thing that Ana Clara Muro and her people showed last week, that after we did the project here in the workshop here on the mining, the iron quadrilateral, that the people in the city who Ana Clara and her people trained to go into the favelas, and they trained 14-year-olds to use the software to help their parents make a plan. And I think that's That's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary accomplishment and very, very important, okay? Because what you're doing then is you're bringing decision making that's really important to people to those people and having them participate as equals, if not superiors, in a process. And I think that's exactly what should be done. Now, in the real world, the most successful example is Balandre. We did a workshop, we did a whole study using geodesign principles in 2002 in La Paz, which is Baja California Sur, the capital. It's not the capital, it's the biggest, one of the cities, main cities in Baja California, in Mexico. And part of that study area is the most beautiful beach that I've ever seen. And we made a study, and we made a very big public presentation. And one of the outcomes of the study was that the beach was threatened by a huge resort development. And the study that we did caused a group of people to protest against the beach development. And a consequence of that was that the mayor created the first public beachfront park on the Sea of Cortez. And I consider this to be an enormous professional accomplishment, not because we built something, but because we stopped something being built. All right? And that's still the case now. It's still a public beach where everybody can go swimming free, and you don't have to just go to the beach. All right? And it was a project in which $1 billion were going to be spent on a piece of land that was stolen by a former president of Mexico. It was public land stolen for the private benefit of a former president of Mexico. Everybody knew this. And so the project was killed because of the study. I'm very proud of that.
So you think it's a very important tool for redistributing power among...
Again, it can be, but again, it doesn't guarantee it. I want to make that very clear. Methods and tools can be misused, and they can be used for public good. They can be used for public bad equally. If you tell me what design you want, I know that I can maneuver the tools to give you your design. But that's true of any design, of any plan. So that's not different in that sense. On the other hand, the ideas which surround geodesign, which people are promoting, are basically based on the diagram that I designed for the cover of my book. The people, the sciences, the design professions, and the information technology working together. And the people are part of that process. They should be part of that process. They should be the most important part of it.
And one of the problems, the experience in Savannah that you mentioned brought to my mind one of the problems we've been facing in teledesign very strongly, and I think in many Brazilian cities and likely in other countries as well, which is a question of jurisdiction. The urban areas often move across lines, city lines, state lines,
absolutely.
country lines.
That's right.
And then usually you have a very big problem to solve, because you have not only people trying to solve the problem, but people from different...
This is not a new problem. It's the history of London, it's the history of Boston, and it's the history of adjusting governmental responsibility and civic responsibility to meet the geography and the systems that have to be managed. If you have a water system that goes across state lines, they have to be coordinated. If it's all in one watershed, you can't have one state flooding another state without repercussions. It has to be managed as systems related to the scale that they operate on. And we don't, and for example, Brazil, like most countries, has planning and implementation responsibilities based on political jurisdictions. But real planning in the future is going to not be that way at all. It's going to be based on watersheds. It should be based on watersheds because water will disappear faster than urban jurisdictions. So we're not necessarily, and we don't plan transportation by metropolitan area, we plan it by the pieces. And those are just foolish. Now there's a lot of power and a lot of influence by these local governments, but they don't work at the scale of the metropolitan areas that are now coming into the world, cities of 20, 30, 40 million people. But that's absurd. It's absurd to run those at local level. It's not absurd to run everything at regional level, but some things should be regional, some things should be local.
From your Mexican experience, it's obvious that geodesign tools are very important for opening up processes for the people, like you said.
Can be, yes.
Is there any kind of precaution or any kind of measures that, is there any way to manipulate people, like to use
Sure.
tools?
Yes. Yeah. The answer is yes. If you're inclined to manipulate people, tools can allow you to do that. I fully understand that. But the experience that we've had so far, and the experience of most of the people that are using geodesign ideas and tools, not just the tools, but the ideas behind it, are involving ordinary people in the design of very complicated situations, as opposed to making a design professionally and then just showing it for approval or disapproval, maybe not even disapproval, just showing it. And it tries to redefine, it tries overtly to redefine the concept of what public participation is. Now, there are shortcomings. When we do a project, we might have 30 people. Well, 30 out of 30 million. I mean, it still raises the question of who are the people who are participating? How did you pick them? Are they random? Is it crowdsourced? What are their roles? There are all kinds of very serious problems. But you have to compare those problems against the problems of not doing it that way. And you'll see that it's probably an improvement. At least I hope it's an improvement. So far, I must say that so far, with Geodesign Hub as one group of tools, because there are other sets of tools, believe me, there are. But the group of tools that I've been helping to implement, we've done about 100 projects. And I don't think any of them have been a failure. Nobody's gone away really angry. And that's pretty good. If you had 100 plans, you'd have a lot of angry people. We haven't. And if we ask people, and we have almost always, do you feel that you've had your voice in this process? And they say, not all, but enough. We're satisfied, because the end product is a negotiation, and they're part of that process. It's not, I'm imposing my design or your design on these people. It's a very, very different psychological aspect of being part of a plan. And it's appreciated, so far. It could always change, but so far it's a promising movement, with a set of promising tools and a set of promising ideas, and there are an increasing number of people interested, which I'm very happy about.
Nice. My experience with the participatory processes in general, they're usually either, when there are criticisms, and often they're usually either that the process is not open enough, or that it's not open enough. You can do certain things, you're restricted to a certain kind of interaction. And sometimes it's too open and it doesn't engage people, it doesn't, people can't relate to it because it's so too open and people...
I think that's my view of the world's participatory processes is that they're boring. And there's one reason. Because in most cases, they are run as a meeting in which one person speaks at a time, unless they're yelling at each other. Okay? The tools that we're designing for geodesign are quiet, and everybody's working. So they're talking in terms of the substance of the policies and projects which are the basis of the design. And it's a much more civilized process, because everybody in the workshop is making a design. And then they have to figure out a way to make something come out the other end that is one design, more than likely. They don't have to, but that's the usual product. And there's no one person dominating the discussion, which is very purposeful. It's very, very purposeful in the way we work with the tools. And so if you come and join us, you're immediately put to work. And you're listening to a small number of people, mixed people, that are working toward a single objective, and then you have to merge your objectives. And I think that that's very useful. It's very useful.
And do you expect the tools, Geodesign Hub and any other tools that are used for geodesign to evolve over time?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They're evolving every day now. Whether they're commercial and being improved, of which there are several, or whether they're a mixture of open source people collaborating together, they're improving very rapidly. I know that almost every week we make a change in what's available through Geodesign Hub, and I know that Esri is improving its system substantially. I know that City Engine is doing the same thing. This is a very highly competitive, not competitive, it is competitive in a sense, but it's a highly adapting set of technologies with people collaborating all around the world, because the internet allows, Rishi Balal, who's the main person behind Geodesign Hub, is working with people in many countries, building API applications that can interact with the core software. The core software has no content. It's just basically managing a design process. But the process that it's managing is based in large part, at least, on work that I and a few other people collaborating with me have done for 50 years.
There's, I think it is Ryan Norland who talks about there's a loop, a learning loop,
yeah,
of when people participate and they learn about it and they
that's right.
participate further.
That's
There's a double loop where they feedback on.
That's exactly what happens. We've had many people come take a workshop with us and say, we think that this could be improved in the following way. They make an improvement, we take it in and keep going. Absolutely.
You see open source culture as a relevant part of that?
The open source culture is definitely a relevant part of it. But there are other technological changes. For example, these are ultimately going to be open source, but they have to feed people, so there's a business involved as well. But the business is to rent services rather than buy software or license software. It's a very different business model, and nobody's going to get very rich. And the other thing that's true, although it's not predictable exactly, is the half-life of software systems may end up being shorter and shorter and shorter. And that's because of hardware changes and computer theory changes as well. There's a very important set of issues related to artificial intelligence, the question of whether you can define a problem sufficiently so that an AI machine can make a better design than you can. If it can play chess better, why can't it make a design better? And those are very interesting questions. I suspect in the next decade we'll have lots of experiments along those lines.
Some people support the idea that if there is any actual artificial intelligence being developed, it should be open, like Elon Musk's initiative.
Well, I happen to agree with that, but it's nonetheless not likely to be totally that way. And you also have the very complicated relationship between military and civilian research and development, in which the military generally is a decade ahead, and secret besides. So you have these situations in the world that you're really not sure how it's going to turn out, but you can bet that the experiments are being made even right now. And I'm skeptical, by the way. I'm skeptical that if you have a computer-generated design and you present it to the same people that you have to deal with in participatory things, whether they'll accept it coming from a computer rather than from a professional. I have my doubts.
A very important part of the geodesign processes seems to be the gathering and processing of information that is going to serve as the basis maps for the actual processes. When you have a very short time to work on very large scale projects, you have to have data that's reliable, that you can trust, right?
Trust more or less.
Yes. Well,
not perfectly. No data that is available is perfect, because it's by definition the past. Okay, so it's more rather than less reliable. I'm happy with that.
And then at the same time, there are a lot of city level initiatives of open data, and a lot of cities I've heard complain about the fact that they have open data portals and people don't use them or don't interact with them enough. Do you see the connection there? Or?
Yeah, I do. I think that's true. I think that the technological assumption that people want to spend their entire day on the computer so that they could participate in everything that they basically elect people and professionals to do is foolish. I think it's a waste of people's time. They have other things they have to do, including feeding their family and playing with their children. And I think that that's a mirage of the technological people. I think it's nonsense, actually. My view is this. If you know why you're doing the study, and you've answered the why questions in my framework, and now you have to go to the how are we going to work questions. It's very important for you to define the 10 or so systems that you're going to be dealing with, and then go up the framework questions, and eventually you'll say, what's the data that we need to do the studies that we need to do to get to an answer? And at that point, my view is get the minimum data, not the maximum data. And I have not yet found an inability to find public sources. I've had some difficulty in some countries where data is secret. But in general, I've never found a real problem in acquiring the data that I would need to do the beginning strategic stages of a very complicated design. And I really believe that data needs to be collected only when you have a purpose and use for it. So I have no patience whatsoever with simple data collection. None. I think it's a waste of energy, of money, of everything. It's ridiculous, actually. And that's one of the things that at CASA, I told you before we had this interview, I told you about the conference that we had about smart cities and big data. And the people who understood and developed a cynical attitude towards big data are the people who really talked about how much data we are going to be collecting on the upgrade of all the sensors. And there's no way that a human being can understand it, so it has to be artificial intelligence. And that intelligence doesn't exist yet, because they don't know what the questions are. So I think that this is technical companies selling stuff that is a waste of money and human intelligence. I'm not in favor.
On the smart city topic, there seems to be like this two different views. One of them is that a few very strong, very rich companies are going to dominate the data gathering and whatever decisions are going to be getting made through that data. And there's these a few authors who talk about, write about public empowerment through being able to gather and process and propose over data.
I think there's a huge difference between gathering and proposing. And I think it's easy to gather, it's hard to propose. And that I don't believe either of those two models. I think that the big companies will try, but whether they succeed or not, I'm skeptical. And I certainly am skeptical to everybody collecting everything about everybody. And what does it mean? It means you've collected data, stored it somewhere in a cloud or in a huge machine somewhere, but it's not going to be useful. It might be useful for some things, by the way. But if you want to see what a public danger might be of manipulating people, that's where you should start to look.
And then you talk a little bit about design and the world design and making decisions and how usually when you're looking at data, you're looking at the past. So you think geodesign is basically, just to sum up, a way of people collaborating and imagining new futures together?
I think not just imagining new futures, but yes to what you said. But those futures are in part rooted upon their experience and their hopes for something different, perhaps. So yes, I think that that's what its main purpose is. Its main purpose is to change the trajectory that many people feel of things going badly. And so if you are modeling something that's going badly, you have to turn it around this way. And the question is, how do you turn it around this way? That's the problem.
More about proposing than understanding.
It's both. No, it is definitely about proposing based on your understanding. But it's your experience of understanding and the data, not just the data and not just artificial intelligence. It's a human process supported by data, not a data process manipulated by humans.
That's very important.
It is important, I agree.
Yes. I think we're going to wrap it up in a few seconds. Just to finish it. We talked a little bit about the institutional aspect of planning, of how it should be integrated and all that. What do you think that means in terms of individuals, that is professionals, current professionals?
I think I have a very long-term answer to that. If you're a university student, you should know a lot about a little and a little about a lot, but not just a lot about a little, nor just a little about a lot. Therefore, I think that you can't have education without time. Okay, and that the people who start in depth and then move this way are fine, and the people who start across this way and then discover that they want this are also fine. But the people who only do this or only do this, not going to be as effective. One of them might win the Nobel Prize, but they won't be the Minister of Environment.
Maybe they will be.
Maybe they will be. You never know. You never know. Okay. But that's what I believe. I believe you need to know something that somebody else doesn't, but enough to talk to lots of people this way.
And that applies to current professionals as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The people who are going to survive professionally in a changing professional environment are not the people who are experts in one piece of software, or in one detail of how to build windows, or in one material. It's not going to be that way. The professions are going to change much more rapidly. They have to be themselves adaptable.
Well, I'd like to thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Unfortunately, we don't have the whole afternoon to talk about this. I would like very
Okay.
much to do so.
Fine. Happy to be here. I've enjoyed my visit very much.
Glad to hear. Is there anything we haven't covered in this?
No, I think you've asked me some very good, profound, difficult questions. Very good. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
On my
Thank you.
behalf and on behalf of everyone at the
Thank
College
you.
of Arquitetura. Thank
Good.
you very much.
Very good.
See you again very soon.
Thank you.